everybody, and welcome to today's presentation, How to Find the DevOps Strategy That Best Fits Your Needs, brought to you by Influx Data. I would like to introduce you to our presenter, Katy Farmer. Katy lives in Oakland, California with her husband and 2 dogs. She loves to experiment with code, break stuff, and try to fix it. She learned to code at Turing School of Software and Design in Denver, Colorado, and it gave her the perfect chance to break stuff before she knew how to fix it.
Great, thank you so much. I'm always excited to be here doing these webinars and being able to share a little bit of what I've learned with all of you. I'm relatively new to DevOps. I'm about a year into my experience, and I found that the longer I'm in it, the more I understand, but I never want to forget what it was like to be new to DevOps and be super overwhelmed. So this is a little bit about my introduction to DevOps and how you can make it work to your advantage when you're new, or even when you're just beginning to adopt these practices at your businesses. So first, hi, I'm Katy. I'm a developer advocate at Influx Data. And the first question I usually get is, what is a developer advocate? So that's what I'll answer first. Basically, my job is to be the voice of the community to the company and the voice of the company to the community. So kind of a full circle. I want to represent the needs of our users and then try to represent the company the best that I can. And this is because we work in open source, where we rely on the community to tell us how we're doing and to help us make contributions. Basically, I'm a technical explainer and friend to all. So I am more than happy to connect with you on Twitter if that's the kind of thing you like to do. And my contact info will also be on the last slide at the end. So let's get started. So first, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Influx, because you're probably wondering, what does Influx Data have to do with DevOps? What are you? Why are you here? There's a lot of questions, right? So at Influx Data, we specialize in time series data. We think this is a specialty problem. So think about, for example, weather data. It comes in high volume, and it has a natural time order. So we're not just talking about time as a factor. We're talking about data whose value is increased by the timestamp. So think about any data you have where time is one of the axes that you care about. Because I care that it was 62 degrees in San Francisco, but more specifically, I care at what time it was 62 degrees. Because if I'm leaving for work, I need to know what the temperature is right now, not in 3 hours and not 3 hours ago. So time is very much one of the axes that we care about in weather data, and that's characteristic of time series data overall. Another good point is that time series data is more valuable as a whole set than as an individual point. And this is because maybe I know that it was 62 degrees at exactly 8:02 a.m., but what about 8:01 and 8:03? Is the temperature really going to be that different? And if it is, well, that probably means something happened, right? We saw a temperature drop or something. So because the high volume of time series data comes in millions and billions of points, individual points contribute to the whole data set, but the data set is more valuable because if we lose a single point out of millions, then we still have an intact data set. Now at Influx, we think this means that you need a place to store this kind of data. You need a way to collect it. You need ways to take action based on it. and you need to be able to visualize it. So that's where we spend our time and effort. And the way that this fits into DevOps, more specifically, is that DevOps is all about communication and being able to react and be adaptive in the face of what other teams are doing, what other systems are doing. And at Influx, we think that the way to do this is to have the metrics that allow you to make change. So we have a stack, we call it the tick stack, which is telegraph, influx, chronograph, and capacitor. So we have a collection agent, which is telegraph, to help you collect the data. Now, most of our users in DevOps collect metrics from their networks, from their systems, or just from their applications. And they're often looking for things like, how often did it go down? Was it available when I needed it? What percentage of the time was it available? They need to get value out of these metrics. And if, let's say, their application is down, then they want to be able to take action based on that. So capacitor is our data processing engine that works for alerting. So if I got a 404 from my very cool Ruby on Rails application, then capacitor would then be capable of sending an alert out to the sort of framework of my choice, right? If I just wanted a Slack message, or if you wanted to use PagerDuty or Alerta or whatever makes you happy and enables you to react the quickest, then you can use that as part of capacitor. So there are a few options for what to do with your data when you collect it, right? You can just store it in InfluxDB, whether for short or long term, works for both. You can alert based on it if you're watching for some threshold to be hit, or you can then visualize it in chronograph. And I think for me, this makes sense, right? But it didn't always make sense because, like I said, I'm fairly new to DevOps. So about a year ago, I started at Influx, and maybe my first or second day, someone said, "Oh, you're going to be going to a lot of DevOps conferences. You're going to be really deep in the DevOps community." And I had never heard that before. I hadn't heard the term, much less like knew what I would be doing with those conferences and communities. So I started Googling, and I Googled for like 3 days. And it wasn't that successful because it turns out when you Google just DevOps, you don't really find a good definition of what it is, because there are so many tools that are part of DevOps that what you really get is a list of tools. So I would Google, what is DevOps? And then I would see things like the best DevOps tools for your DevOps needs. And I didn't know what my DevOps needs were, so it didn't make sense to me to be looking at tools to do it. Even though I understood that Influx was one of those tools, I had to go farther back. Yes, my job was to learn Influx because I work here, but more importantly, I felt that it was my job to understand what DevOps was and how we were actually going to contribute to it. And when I started really learning and digging through articles upon articles about various technologies, what I learned is that most of the articles, most of the resources, they weren't written for people like me who are new, or even for companies like Influx, where we're about average size, maybe a little over 100 people. And we have some big use cases, right? With small customers and big customers alike, but as a company, we're kind of average in size and age, other factors, right? So how was I going to start using techniques that were built for Google or Amazon or Netflix at our much smaller company? Well, I kind of thought back to what I'm good at. And frankly, I'm kind of your average expert. That's why I started to think about, well, what does it mean to be average in this landscape? What happens when you're not one of the groundbreakers? And that's okay, right? Most people aren't. Facebook and Google, they wouldn't be sort of these titans of industry unless there was the rest of us, right? They're spectacular at what they do for lots of reasons. They have, resources and huge teams. And the rest of us, we have to use their tech. They're often the most innovative and the most cutting edge, but we're the ones who use their technology. They might invent it, but the rest of us, we perfect it. It's important to remember in this context that being an average company, it does not mean small, and it does not mean irrelevant, and it does not mean easy. Average just means most common. So companies like Influx and maybe the companies that you work at, we're solving hard problems, but we have to adapt the tech that exists because it was built for probably companies with more employees and more resources and more time. But some interesting things happened when I tried to model my DevOps take after the titans of industry, which is sort of like me just stepping out and being like, I'm a professional athlete now, and then getting hit in the face with every kind of sports ball that exists. Because being really great at DevOps, using complicated tools like Kubernetes, I'll pick on it a little bit because it is sort of like the most popular one at the moment. It requires, it's like going from 0 to 100, right? If I don't know how I want DevOps to look at my company, then how much good will it do me to just start using Kubernetes and hoping for the best? It does me almost no good. And the reason is not because Kubernetes doesn't have value. It's because a lot of these tools and systems rely on the fact that we, as the users of them, know what we want as an outcome. We have to know which metrics matter to us and how to get them. And the tools don't always help with that. In fact, the learning curve on a lot of them can be steep enough that you spend enough time just trying to learn it, and you kind of forget the original mission you had, which is, of course, to offer back some value to your company. But how valuable is it for you to spend all of your time learning a tool and then not know how to get what you need from that tool? How do we get from the beginning of our journey into DevOps into the real tough parts? Because it's not easy to get to what I would think is the finish line of DevOps. And arguably there is no finish, right? You just continue into DevOps, maybe forever. And I think for me, that means that we have to find a way to navigate these obstacles, because it's not impossible to become good at DevOps if you're not a big company, but it does require a little bit of fundamental knowledge. And that's really what I got out of my my reading when I was investigating DevOps when I started. Just when I read enough blogs and books and manuals for different tools, what I found were some underlying principles. And those are the things that help you adapt DevOps. The first thing is insight. Now, that can be a little vague, right? But again, this relies on the fact that you, as the developer or sysadmin or whatever your role is at the company, you know what your system has to offer. And it's a little complicated because you get into this place of either known unknowns or unknown unknowns, which is something I heard someone say and is really interesting, because insight means that you can look for things you know you need, right? So for instance, the first thing I did when I was really trying to learn Influx as this kind of monitoring and DevOps tool is I took an old application, which was a Ruby on Rails app that just posted blogs, and I instrumented it with Influx. And I asked myself, what can I learn from gathering these metrics? Well, one, I learned that my app didn't work at all because I hadn't used it for a few months, and my code was a little brittle to begin with. So the first thing I learned was that, 404s are sad. But once I got the app up and running, I started to wonder, what can I measure that would be useful to me? And turned out there were so many things. Even as a web developer, which is my sort of area of expertise, I could measure how long database requests took or didn't take, page rendering times, and whether that was dependent or not on the database requests. I could measure whether it was serving a 404 or a 200, and I could store all of that in a database and then visualize it and say to myself, hey, this app only worked 70% of the time. Or worse, which is what happened, this particular blog view page only worked 70% of the time. And this was an interesting business value to say, okay, my app overall has this kind of sad success rate, but almost all of it stemmed from a singular page where the big O notation was off the charts. It was O to the N onward. And that was something I could trace back through the metrics and fix. So insight doesn't mean a tool, and it doesn't mean that you always have to know what you're looking for, but it does mean you have to be willing to look at your code or your systems in kind of an unbiased way. And when it comes to insight, you should choose tools that help you challenge assumptions, verify behavior, and understand your app better. Now, if this sounds a little bit like test-driven development, good. That's sort of my barometer for making sure that my app does what I want. When I learned to code, I learned it with test-driven development. And what I particularly like about it as a philosophy is that it helps me look beyond the code I'm currently writing and ask from myself as the developer and from the system, ideally, what do I want this to look like? And you should choose a tool that helps you do something similar. You say, ideally, what I would like to know is every time a Docker container has to restart. Great. Then once you have that as a goal, then you can choose a tool that helps you do that. And although I'll be the first to help you get Influx up and running if that's the tool you want to use, I chose Influx because that was the tool that I needed to learn. Because probably most of you work at a place where one day you are, happily working along, and the next someone comes along and says, hey, you all have to know Kubernetes now. So time to learn. And that's okay too. So if you have a team that prefers a tool, then like as long as that tool helps you challenge assumptions and verify behavior, then use that. And once you really get into the nuances of using tools, then it makes more sense to talk about what those tools do well or not. And again, if you want to know all the things that Influx does well, you can just hit me up. But for my purposes, it was easy to install and easy to configure, which was a way for me to get to what I wanted faster. The second fundamental is communication. DevOps really hinges on communication as an idea and in all the tools that you use. Because again, back to when I first started at Influx and I didn't know what DevOps was, a friend of mine recommended that I read this book called The Phoenix Project, which is sort of one of the first books written as an introduction to like the DevOps philosophy. And as I was reading it, I can't say that I had some kind of aha moment. What I had was more like a duh moment because everything I was reading sounded like common sense to me. The problems that the book explained, they all stemmed from people just not talking to each other, from operations and developers being so separate that they were releasing before bugs were fixed and that sort of thing. And the bigger a company is, sometimes the more difficult these structures are to maintain. But it seemed so obvious to me that communication is one of the solutions to this problem. But what does that mean realistically? How do you get that sort of done? Especially when I think about companies that do it well, like all the big ones I've named and many more, I'm sure, they have a database team just for their database. They have a networking team just for their network. They have their web developers separate from their systems developers, and they have all these tools, and they manage their communication really well into giving you one thing at the end, whether that's an internet browser or Windows 95. But what works for them doesn't always work at companies where we don't have time to perfect our area because, well, we don't have a whole team devoted to it. So what do we need from communication in terms of tools? One, you should choose tools that help you prioritize. Because if, like me, you don't have a team you can call and say, hey, I need you to fix A. Most of the time, if I think that, then I can just say it to myself. Hey, Katy, I need you to fix this. And then I'll make a note to myself and fix it later. Because we don't have hundreds and hundreds of people to help solve problems. What we do have are really talented people who are ready to do what you ask them to, but also each one of us has to prioritize. And when I say choose tools that help you prioritize, this can be something as simple as knowing that an Slack message means it's urgent and an email means it can wait. It's not necessarily always a tool. It can be a philosophy or even just a soft rule. We also need to choose tools that help us empathize. When I think about DevOps and some of the original problems that it tried to solve, there were these huge gaps between developers and operations, right? And it seems to me in what I read that at the time, it felt like an insurmountable obstacle because developers didn't understand the problems in operations and the people in operations didn't understand the developers' problems. This is a good recourse for cross-training, spending a week in somebody else's job or shadowing. Tools that help you empathize are small things, like maybe a chat channel where you can go over support cases, or even a post-mortem for something that went wrong where everyone is invited. Because understanding what went wrong and also how it was fixed is an important part of stopping that from happening again. Because small changes can still lead to big incidents. How many of you know someone who's made the tiniest change in the code, and they were a veteran like developer, and so you didn't worry. They made a small change, they deployed it, and then maybe 10 minutes later, maybe a day later, production is crashing. Because these small changes can still have these big ripple effects throughout the system. I sometimes forget to change the port numbers back when I am fussing on my local machine. I'll change it to local port numbers, and then I'll push it out to production, and then I'll realize that I didn't change the port numbers back. I'm not saying that's something I do all the time. I'm just saying it's happened. These small changes still lead to 404s from the users, and that's not good, right? I do like to make a note here about automation and optimization, because a lot of times in DevOps, automation is the end goal. And I don't talk about it a lot for two reasons. One is that I think that for me, I haven't really reached a place where automation makes sense yet, because the time it takes me to try to understand and set up the automation is more time than it would take me to do the task manually. and I try to weigh that every time I think about automation, so that I'm not, sort of disproportionately spending time on automation when it's not going to happen. I also think that when you're just starting out and your company is just adopting DevOps technologies, and you say like, okay, I'm going to enter a monitoring tool and maybe like some logs, that's great. And you already have so much data that there's a lot to do just with that. And moving straight on to automation can be, one, really overwhelming, and two, making you more removed from the process can slow down your learning a little bit. That being said, if the end goal for you is automation, then you should move toward it. But just ask yourself along the way, is this the best use of your time? Again, when we say average, we don't mean that you can't handle a ton of data or a ton of workload, right? At Influx, one of the things we sort of pride ourselves on is the sheer amount of data the database is capable of writing in and storing and querying. So it doesn't mean small use cases. What it means is that at an average company, you're not one of the anomalies. You're not one of like the Silicon Valley 1%. What you are is typical. You have typical use cases, and they're still unique to you, but they're not, what am I trying to say? Sorry. They're unique to you, but they're not small or irrelevant in any way. It just means that average is a good fit. So where does Influx fit in this, I like to think that we do insight and communication really well because, like I talked about, being able to set up the tool easily is a big part of getting started. And I always say that if I can read the docs and install Influx, then anyone can. And being able to have metrics to back you up is a really important part of making change. Because if I go to my friend Anadelia and I say, you know what, this isn't working, I don't think we should do it, she would say to me, how do you know it's not working? And if I don't have data to back myself up, then how can I expect her to, she just believes me because we're like best friends? Or should she believe me because I bring her data and I say, look, I'm seeing a 12% dip in productivity. Sorry, that was a lot of jargon. But I think you get my point, which is that metrics make you more believable. When I go to my boss, he says to me, hey, I actually saw that like more people read your last blog post. Why do you think that is? I can tell him why, because then I can open up my metrics and say, oh, it got retweeted by someone super cool on Twitter, and then it led more people to it. That sort of thing makes me more respected by my boss and my peers. And frankly, it just makes me better at my job. I think that what I like particularly about this graphic made for Influx is that it says instrument, observe, learn, automate. So you'll notice automate is still kind of last. Although, I mean, there is no last, right? It's a circle, but I'm just saying. This is the exact process that I followed when I was instrumenting my first application. I said, okay, I'll just throw Influx into this Ruby on Rails app. And then I observed, oh, it's broken. And I did this a bunch of times, and every time I learned. And for me, that's a lot of value. If you have a DevOps use case where you have something that needs monitoring, Influx is probably a really good place to start because it's a tool that helps you prioritize. It's easy to install, and it has what I like to call developer happiness, which means it's just a single config file. You can just change some variables there. There's not a huge learning curve, and there's a lot of resources, and it's really strong community. Again, it's open source also, so that always helps. If you're going to try out a new tech, it always helps to be able to do it for free. You can download it in less than 5 minutes. You can go to our GitHub. You can go to our site. You can talk to me. Or if you have questions about other tools that you can get started with, I'm happy to tell you about those too. If you have a Timeseries use case, then yeah, I'll always tell you to use Influx probably. But if you have a different use case and you want to know what the best tool is, then I'll help you try to find that too. We also have a really great community site. You can go visit and see the kinds of questions people have and the help that they're getting. You can read more learning materials from me if you like fun graphics and you like my style. Again, tweet at us. If you tweet at the company, they've been known to give out socks and stickers. And you can email me. I think we're going to go to a Q&A now, but ask away. I'm here.
Great. Our first question is, how do you compare to Elastic?
Yeah, great question. I get asked this a lot every time we're at an event. There's usually a booth for Elastic somewhere close to us, and we work a lot with them. So if you don't know, Elastic is a similar kind of database, but they're focused on text-based search, and they're really good at that. The difference between us and Elastic is just about specialty. So a good question to ask yourself is, what do you need from your data? Is it more important that you have precision time all the way down to the nanosecond, then I will tell you to use Influx. If you also need, let's say, you need to be able to search the logs by looking for a keyword, then maybe Elastic is a better choice. A lot of times people use both, and they will send the full log details with the full strings to Elastic and condense data over to Influx. That way, they can use Influx for a quick query to help them figure out what went wrong or if something went wrong. And then they can search Elastic and find the full details there without having to search every single log.
Awesome. Our next question is, do you think this product could support me in my new startup company?
Yeah. I mean, the short answer, I'm going to say yes. I would maybe need more details, but we have, I want to say something like 90% of our users are on the open source. They throw a lot of data at it. They use it for everything from monitoring their databases to tracking whale pods in the Atlantic Ocean. So there's really not a use case we haven't seen for Influx. And again, because it's open source and it's easy to use, we have a strong community, I highly suggest it for people who are just starting out, especially when your company is small.
Great. Our next question is, what tools do you recommend for someone getting started?
Also good. I'm a big fan of the open source community. So I always say to start with open source. Influx is great. If you need monitoring, if you need logs, I like logs.io. Depending on your use cases. I'm also a fan of some of the new open source offerings from Microsoft are surprisingly good. Microsoft is when you get outside of the world of Windows, they're actually doing a really great job in in open source and releasing some really cool projects in Azure. I think if you're just getting started, stick in the world of open source. Talk to people in the DevOps communities, attend a DevOps days in your area. They're all over the place, and they're just a really great community of people to be able to talk to, and they have more recommendations than I will ever in my lifetime. So.
Awesome. Our next question is there any processes or data analyzer which may correlate to different data points at a time series?
Interesting. I'm sorry. I'm going to interpret this question, and if I'm not right, feel free to clarify or ask again. The process essentially looks like if you're collecting the data and sending it to the database, then you have to set up rules for analysis because you're the expert on your data. So there's a few things, some smaller sort of machine learning things like a whole Winters algorithm that's built into capacitor. But when it comes to the analysis of the data, you kind of have to know what you need to know. That being said, we've made it really easy so that if you say, every time, or if you know what kind of data transformation you want, we've made that easy to do. So if you only want to know the averages, you can compute the averages and get rid of all the raw precision data. You can analyze the data for anomalies using a function that you've written and then send the results back to Influx. So we don't do the actual analysis, but we give you all the tools to be able to set up what you need. You can write the function that determines your data transformation or anomaly detection or what have you. And then we can set up the pipeline that helps you get the results and get alerts based on that and that sort of thing.
Awesome. Our next question is, what are your parameters to select DevOps tools, and how do you keep upgrading?
Oh man, that's a great question. I think for me, when I'm selecting tools, I do look at the community. Like, are there a lot of other people using it? Because I know that I'm going to have questions, and I want to make sure there's like a community of people and resources who can help me use the tool. And and that sort of applies to the upgrade piece as well, because it's really upsetting when you like try to upgrade a piece of software and then things don't work like they did in the previous version, etc. So it's always helpful to me to have a community site to go to and say, hey, this is what happened to me when I upgraded. Does anyone else see this? And usually someone else has. I also look for ease of use, unless there's some outstanding circumstances. I'm going to look for a tool that has good documentation, easy to install, and doesn't take a really long time. Because in the end, you don't really care about the tools, you care about the outcome. The tools are just there to help you learn your system better or get the alerts, do the monitoring. So I don't want to spend a lot of time having to become an expert in the tool. I just want to get down to business with my application. So those are kind of my main two. I look for how easy is it to use, and is there a strong community that can help support me when I have questions. And as far as knowing when to upgrade, I mean, I'm one of those people who will wait. I'll wait until some other people have upgraded and see how it goes for them. But usually I find that when I trust the tool and trust the company, I'm pretty willing to do upgrades. It is hard to know when to do it. Usually for me, I'll hold off on upgrades unless there's a feature that I know that I need. So for instance, one of the versions of Influx had a logs feature we added, and now we could stream logs to our visualization tool, Chronograph. And that was something that was really interesting to me that I had been waiting for. So I upgraded right away. And then I was able to report a couple bugs and have them fixed by the developers. But if there's a feature I really need, then I'll try to keep up with the upgrade process. That being said, I just helped someone the other day upgrade from 0.88 of InfluxDB to 1.6. So maybe don't let yourself get that far behind, because the upgrade process gets really difficult if you wait a really long time. So there's some kind of happy medium where is there a feature that I need? Or if it's a version upgrade that just has small changes, that's even better, because the smaller releases, the upgrades are much smoother.
Awesome. Looks like we only have one question left, and that question is, can I contribute to the projects?
Oh, of course. That is the greatest part of open source, is that if you, for example, Telegraph, our collection agent, is totally plugin driven. So it operates strictly on input and output. And there are something like 150 plugins, and our developers at Influx have maybe written 7 of them. So we love contributions from the community. If there's a plugin you want to see or a feature you want to see, we're always happy. You can go to, let me go back a slide. You can go to our GitHub, and there's instructions for contributing there. You can also go to the community site and have a discussion there about changes you'd like to see or new features you'd like to see. I would be happy to see them there.
Great. Well, Katy, is there anything you would like to add before we wrap things up?
I'll just add that we also, in addition to having a cool community site, we also help run a series of meetups called Timeseries. San Francisco is our main one. That's where I am. We also have meetups all over the US, and we're starting to have a couple international. We're starting in Barcelona and Munich, I think, and maybe also Berlin. So we're opening up new meetups, and we're happy to help you if you want to be an organizer and want to have a time series meetup. It doesn't have to be Influx specific. We just want to help you, sort of like teach and have a nice environment for people to come learn in. So if that's something you're interested in, you can reach out to me or reach out on the community site. Or if you're ever in San Francisco, you can come by Time Series San Francisco and say hi.
Awesome. And Katie, we actually did get one more question in while you were saying that. The next question is, could you please share a quick overview of the software development process?
Yep. I'm laughing only because that's just such an interesting question. No one has ever asked that before. So I'll talk a little bit about how we do it at Influx, because it's very different depending on your company. But at Influx, we start with a couple things, which is we do what some people call dog fooding, which is we use our own product to monitor ourselves. So we have an InfluxDB instance that keeps track of our products and lets us know if they're working and how well they're performing and how many users there are, that kind of thing. And we start with those metrics as a way to ask, what needs to be improved, which product needs the most attention. And we have a few teams here. We have a team that's devoted to the API, one that's devoted to the database, and then one that handles chronograph. So in the chronograph team is the one I know the most about, so I'll tell you a little bit about what their process looks like. We get quite a few feature requests. And when we receive a request, first it kind of goes to like the product manager, and the product manager decides, one, is it like a common request? Does more than one person want it? And two, does it make sense? Is it in line with our goals for the product and the community? After that, it gets broken down into a lot of pieces so that we can incorporate it into chronograph incrementally if possible, so that we can have smaller releases. Because the idea is that the smaller the release, the less chance that there will be bugs or unexpected ripples like we talked about. But most of the time, the development process looks like they write out a story in as small of the pieces as they can, and then they work on each piece of that story until it's completed. And that usually results in a major version. So instead of, let's say, releasing 1.7.1, if we went into a big feature request and got it finished, we would maybe just go straight to 1.8. That's sort of the general feel of what that looks like here. Our engineers spend everything from 2 days to 2 months on features, depending on how complex they are. Sometimes we add one of our newer sort of chronograph features is being able to change the colors on the graphs for emphasis and also for visibility. That I don't think took a huge amount of time for our designer Alex, but implementing the log viewer in chronograph took about a month straight from another engineer or 2 or 3 to really get working as well as we wanted it to. So there's a lot of variation in how the process works. Sometimes that depends on the team, and sometimes it just depends on the feature entirely. I hope that was the question you were asking. I might have answered a different question, but
Awesome. Well, I'd like to thank you, Katie, for a great presentation today. I'd also like to thank today's sponsor, Influx Data, for providing the DZone audience with a great webinar presentation. And lastly, thank you to everyone who showed up today. We hope you learned something new that'll help you in your developer career. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.